So I don't know if everybody knows how incredibly instrumental the Brandeis Center was in Ben & Jerry's. How did you come to be involved representing the Israeli franchisee? And also, how did you develop this legal strategy that was creative and brilliant and a winning strategy?
Ben & Jerry's case, as soon as the announcements took place last July, grabbed my attention. In addition to the Brandeis Center, where I've been president now for the last 4 years, for over 20 years I've had a law practice with my father, Nathan Lewin. We've handled a slew of cases on these kinds of issues of importance to the Jewish community, including, for example, the Jerusalem passport case. And so my father, who thinks very legally and strategically, immediately said, there has to be a way for Avi Zinger, who, and he's not a franchisee, he actually is the one and only, or was, the one and only licensee of Ben & Jerry's. My father said there has to be a way for him to actually bring a lawsuit in the United States. Now, Avi Zinger, just so you know, he brought Ben & Jerry's ice cream to Israel before most Americans even knew what it was. He's been doing this now for almost 35 years. He started, been living in the States for years. He was getting ready to move back, looking for a business to bring to Israel. And he discovered this brand new Vermont, ice cream in Vermont, and thought Israel has no such thing as this kind of premium ice cream. So he met with Ben Cohn and pitched him this idea. I will tell you that it started with Ben then suggesting that he go talk to his lawyer. Avi, the Israeli, borrowed a suit and a tie and a briefcase and met with the lawyer who was wearing jeans and a t-shirt and sandals. And that's how the partnership began. And Avi started with one scoop shop, and when he brought that to Israel, there were lines out the door. Now he's built it up and developed. He has a factory. He manufactures the Ben & Jerry's ice cream in Israel. That's why the only place in the world where you could get kosher for Passover Ben & Jerry's ice cream is in Israel, because he koshers his factory. He has some flavors like charoset, which you can only get in Israel. About 10 years ago, the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, started pushing really hard on this social mission in Ben & Jerry's in Vermont. And they started by writing letters, then they went and they upped the ante by going every time there was the free cone day at the franchisees, when you had the customers waiting on lines down the block that would hand out these very inflammatory leaflets. And then they started online campaigns. And so the pressure kept building and building until, of course, last May 2021, when there was the conflict in Gaza, and we all saw, because on campuses we also saw all the online hate, that's when the pressure really reached its peak. And so come July, right, what happened is the board in Vermont was pushing Avi Zinger to say, I will stop all sales in what BDS calls the occupied Palestinian territories, or we know as Judea and Samaria, East Jerusalem, or the West Bank. And Avi Zinger said, I cannot and I will not do that. And one of the things that, and the reasons that he said it is, he said to them, that's illegal. Not only does it violate the anti-boycott laws in Israel and the anti-boycott laws in the United States, which don't specifically apply to him in Israel, but to the company, the broader company, but he said there's also an anti-discrimination law in Israel. And Israel has a law, just like we have here in the United States. But that law includes, in terms of the categories of individuals that you may not discriminate against in terms of the services you provide, not only like we have here, like I read, race, color, national ethnic origin, gender, it also includes residence. So you can't discriminate in Israel based on where a person resides. Avi Zinger now distributes to supermarkets across the country. He distributes to all the mini markets and all the gas stations across the country. He distributes to markets that are in Ramallah as well. He said, I cannot legally in Israel turn around and say, I'm not going to distribute my product to all the areas across the Green Line. I cannot do it and I will not do it. And so what was Ben & Jerry's response? The Ben & Jerry's response was, okay, then now after 34 years we're ending our relationship. You no longer have a license to manufacture and distribute Ben & Jerry's ice cream in Israel when your current license expires, which is December 31 of 2022. There are folks who tried to suggest that this was just a settlement boycott. It's not a settlement boycott, because what they did is they said, we're not renewing your license. If they don't renew his license, there's nobody in Israel to manufacture and distribute Ben & Jerry's ice cream anymore. So come January 1, 2023, that meant there would be no Ben & Jerry's ice cream manufactured or sold anywhere in Israel. Anywhere in Israel. So what they were really doing was stopping all sales of Ben & Jerry's ice cream throughout all of Israel. That's a boycott of all of Israel. And that's unlawful, not only in Israel, it's unlawful here in the United States. So the theory of the lawsuit, which I will say was my father's legal theory, was that we bring a lawsuit on his behalf against both Unilever and the subsidiary, Ben & Jerry's, homemade in Vermont, and say it's illegal. You cannot, in the United States, have a contract where a condition of a contract is that you're requiring one party to that contract to do something illegal. That's what Ben & Jerry's was demanding. They were saying, if you want us to renew your license and continue this contract, you have to break the law. And he was saying, I can't do that. You cannot have that kind of a contract in the United States. That was the straightforward, simple legal theory. And we brought that lawsuit in New Jersey against Unilever USA, which is headquartered in New Jersey, and the Vermont subsidiary. And we sued for and filed for an initial, what they call preliminary injunction, where we wanted the court to say, you know what, you may not stop his license. You have to continue his license because he has to continue to be making all these business decisions. If we have a dispute, a business dispute, you can work that out. There's a clause that requires you to go to arbitration, but there's a carve out for this injunction that would have demanded that Unilever continue Avi Zinger's license indefinitely until this matter was resolved. That was where our lawsuit stood, that whole preliminary injunction motion was filed and the papers were filed and it was ready to be decided now by the court. And I will say, and this is when you talk about the work of everybody, the work of all the organizations and all the state's attorneys general, and also I should tell you, in Israel, the Israel Competition Authority, one thing that people don't know is that the merger between Unilever and Ben & Jerry's actually had to be approved by the Competition Authority. And because Unilever owns Strauss, which had in 2000 the largest market share of ice cream in Israel, they were only ready to approve the merger on certain conditions. So there was a consent decree that was signed in 2001 where the agreement was that Unilever would allow Avi Zinger to do and run his business as he sees fit. They would stay out because otherwise Unilever would have ended up with controlling the whole ice cream market in Israel. So the Israel Competition Authority was going after Unilever now too because they said you violated the 2001 consent decree, by now trying to control where Avi Zinger sells his ice cream. All of these efforts definitely made it clear to Unilever that this issue was not going away, that they had to resolve it, but they couldn't resolve it without dealing directly with Avi Zinger. And that's where the Brandeis Center, so they put together this team of the Brandeis Center lawyers, my father, and then we had one more lawyer, Mark Zell, who was an American lawyer who lives now in Israel. That was our legal team, and Mark and I negotiated the deal with Unilever. But I will say, Avi Zinger's a hero because he knew from day one, and he felt it because of the effort of all the organizations, that this was about much more than just a business dispute that he had with this ice cream company. This was now an issue of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement and a battle on behalf of the entire Jewish people. And so it was really crucially important to Avi that the resolution address the BDS component and be a victory against the anti-Semitic BDS movement. And that's why what he was able to negotiate with Unilever was, whereas BDS wanted to create the situation where Ben & Jerry's ice cream would never be sold anymore in any part of Israel, he now has an arrangement, which I will tell you is a closed, done deal, where now he has the ability to manufacture and sell the same Ben & Jerry's ice cream forever in Israel, in all of Israel, everywhere, Judea, Samaria, East Jerusalem, and the BDSers have no ability, and the Vermont group has no ability to ever interfere or ever stop, and this is being done now. The one real additional kind of cherry on top of this is that now what's happened is the Vermont Independent Board, unhappy that this effort of theirs to stop the sale of Ben & Jerry's ice cream in Israel has failed so dramatically, has now sued Unilever. And so Unilever, which used to be Avi Zinger's opponent, is now arm in arm with Avi Zinger. And in the papers that they filed just this week in response, they put in as an attachment Avi Zinger's complete declaration that was filed in our case with all the exhibits in support of their position, and they reference it numerous times in their papers. So now they have taken on what was our arguments against the Vermont company and subsidiary, and now Unilever is arm in arm with Avi battling against the Vermont group, which is basically the front and the face for BDS today.